Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Laurie Kirk from APMG in Canberra office, and it's a great pleasure to have my colleagues Jan-Willem from Kuala Lumpur and also Andrew Smailes. So Andrew, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce Jan-Willem and the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Laurie. So I'm Andrew Smailes, I'm the President of DAMA Australia. Welcome to another of DAMA Australia's Grand Designs and Data Management webinars. The name people might have recognised because we borrowed it from the TV show, which is about, ordinary families risking all to experiment with architecture, technology, and their lifestyle. Implementing enterprise data management capability is not too dissimilar in process and outcome. Every organisation has a vision and the outcomes they're wanting, and like home, successful implementations are the ones that create greater emphasis on upfront design, architecture, and planning. Today, within data management, there's been a strong emphasis on technology, with skills and processes largely being overlooked. In the past couple of years, DAMA's data management body of knowledge and CDMP certification has been growing in acceptance. However, there hasn't been a uniform and vendor-neutral standard for big data proficiency in enterprise organizations. I would like to welcome Jan-Willem Middelburg as Regional Director of Pink Elephant, a premier global training, consulting and conference service provider based in Kuala Lumpur. Jan will be talking about the new enterprise big data certification, how it provides a strong foundation of the fundamental concepts and theories of big data technologies and tools. So over to you, Jan-Willem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you, Laurie, as well, for the kind introduction. I'm going to be presenting today, and what we're going to be doing in this webinar is give you an overview of what the Enterprise Big Data Professional certification looks like, why it was developed, what the key and main features are, and afterwards I'll also dive a little bit with you into the content of how the actual model works and what are key elements that you will learn during any course in this area. But before we start, let me say that I'm very, very pleased that, of this collaboration between Pink, DAMA, and APMG. Now you also have a picture to the names. And we're really happy that we can co-host this webinar all together to present a little bit more about big data and what its impact is for the global economy. What you should know after this particular session, well, first of all, of course, you should be aware of what enterprise big data means, and especially what its implications are to organizations all across the globe. It's not going to be an overview only. In the second part of this webinar, I will take a little bit of a deep dive into the actual content. So I'll spend around 10 to 15 minutes on the key and core elements of the framework, and what are capabilities that every person and every organization that is serious about big data should have in order to progress to the next level. So that's the majority of the part of the webinar. Afterwards, I'll also explain to you how you get access to the official course materials and how you can take the APMG examination afterwards. So without further ado, just let's get started. In this first section, I'd like to quickly give you an overview of why this big data certification courses were developed and why this scheme has come to light. And it kind of all began with an article that was published in a Harvard Business Review, and that labeled the data scientist the sexiest job of the 21st century. So this was in 2012, so already quite some years ago. But this article kind of sparked a whole debate and a whole lot of discussion of, well, if that is the job that everybody is going for in the future, and there's so many organizations that are hiring data scientists at this moment, what kind of skills and what kind of capability should a person that wants to be in this role, should he or she possess? And basically that is, I think, one of the key drivers of this program. And if you look at the graph on the right, which shows you the interest over time in terms of what people are looking for on the internet. This is a tool from Google. Here you can see the rapid growth in terms of the people that are actively looking for big data courses. So you see it has grown very, very rapidly, almost from the moment that this article came out, which was in 2012, all the way up to today. So the interest is really, really growing in the last couple of years, and I think it's an unprecedented growth in terms of the speed with which this has come to light. That's the positive side, but if you look at the other way of big data, and you do a quick search on the internet, you're also going to find that there's lots and lots of organizations that are aware that they want to do something with big data, but they are unsure how to do it and how they can realize a feasible return on investment. So a lot of surveys that have been done by consulting organizations now show that starting with big data is not a guarantee for success. There's a whole lot of elements that need to be taken into account. And if you look at the survey, which you see on the right, and you see what the impact is for investments on big data, you still see that a lot of organizations are really, really struggling to make these results feasible and make their projects successful. So what we did is kind of that we took these two developments and dived a little bit deeper into that. On the one hand, there's a tremendous amount of interest in big data. On the other hand, there's also lots of organizations that are really, really struggling to make this successful. And basically, these two developments were the foundation of why we started this program and why this program has come to market in the last year. The Big Data Framework was created because we saw a couple of developments that were happening in the organizations. It's all very nice to say that organization needs to put up a big data team, hire data scientists, get some fancy data analysis tools. But what we really found when we explored this a little bit further is that there's a big gap in terms of the skills and knowledge that people actually need to work with big data projects on a day-to-day basis. So although the interest is very, very large, there's a big skills gap that needs to be filled. The second key observation that we found is that almost all big data courses that are out there are vendor driven. So they are produced and made by companies that also have an interest in selling their tools. So there's lots of very good courses out there which are about Microsoft or Amazon or a Google Cloud Platform. They all provide excellent learnings on how to utilize the technology that is required to process large amounts of data, but they only focus on that. So they don't really dive into the more organizational and management aspects. They don't focus on the reality that is present in enterprises and how to deal with that. The third element that we found is that most of these courses don't really include the people aspect. And I think that's also one of the most important elements, is that big data and processing that successfully is more than just a combination of some experts, some good technology and some processes. You really need to change the hearts and minds of the people and the structure of the organization. So the people aspect, as we will see a little bit later in this webinar, will be one of the most fundamental changes to any other program that is out there. And last but not least, we found that there's not a one uniformly recognized type of certification that is applicable both in Australia, in the US, and in Europe. So for that reason, the conversations with APMG started, and the webinar that we're hosting today is basically the result of these conversations, and we're very proud that this big enterprise big data certification has now been launched. So a long story short, basically the whole big data framework was developed to provide a very practical and hands-on approach for enterprise organizations that have to deal with a lot of other processes and technology and tools in order to make practical next steps to big data. So what were some of the key premises that we set out when we developed this? Well, first of all, we really wanted to be a collaboration between enterprises on the one hand side, educational institutes on the other, and communities like DAMA that we're talking with today on the last part. So really what we try to establish with this program is to create a new best practice, a practice that everybody can understand, everybody can use, and one which is easily to adopt. These kind of programs only really work if there's a whole community of practitioners that are starting to work with this. So that also led us to the second key promise, is that we work with a whole community of collaborators, reviewers, experts from basically all across the planet to put together this program. So we've gathered a lot of input and feedback on what would be a good structure, how should a good program be designed, and based upon that, this program was created. And last, and I think this is also relatively innovative, is that we made sure that the program is free to use. So everything, all the materials that are available are licensed under a Creative Commons license, meaning that they're in the public domain. You do need to recognize where it came from, but other than that, there is no license fees, there's no fees for materials. Everybody can just go online, download the book, and start studying for this certification, but also apply any kind of concepts that you would think is feasible into your own organization. Who did we develop this program for? So what you see on the next slide is some of the people that are interested in these kinds of certifications and are also the main target audience. So, and I think most of the roles that you see here are a very good mix between the IT and data management field on the one hand side, and the business capabilities and persons that are on the other hand side. And I really think that that is what this program does, and what it is aimed for is really building that bridge between business and IT in order to gain that competitive advantage through data. And I think that's what makes big data in the end so incredibly interesting. And what that has resulted in is the publication of 4 guides, 4 certifications, 4 role-based learning paths that all have a different type of specialization. The webinar that we're doing today is a brief overview of the Enterprise Big Data Professional role, which is the entry-level certification and the entry-level skills and knowledge that everybody should have that wants to dive into a more deeper and a more advanced level. So if you look at the picture on the right, you see that there's 3 other levels that are being worked on as we speak. So there's the big data analysts, the big data scientists, and the big data engineer. Each of those is a bit of a more in-depth role that talks about day-to-day capabilities and skills that people need to have that are working in that role. All of these are preceded by this Enterprise Big Data Professional certification, and that's what I will be talking about next in the next couple of slides. What does that mean? You also see that there's now a community online, which can be found on bigdataframework.org. That's also where you can download all those guides that I talked about earlier, and where there's now a community of experts being formed for anybody who has interest to collaborate on this framework. So if you are interested, go to this website and sign yourself up and become part of this community of experts. I'd like to hand over back to DAMA now to just explain a little bit about the relationship between this program and the DAMA DMBOK.
Thanks, Jan-Willem. Yes, I just thought I'd mention about what's, how does this relate to the data management body of knowledge and the certified data management professional certification, which DAMA offers. Really, the the DMBOK and CDMP are about the foundation, building a common foundation regardless of the sort of application of data management. So when I did my computing degree and my MBA, I've had to do accounting 101 because it's pretty important that people know how money is managed in an organization. And so the same applies really. CDMP and DMBOK is what everybody should understand about data management. And then there's the sort of applied or other sort of areas which use those foundation principles then in areas like big data, operational data, or spatial data, or some other area. So I just thought I'd point that out. It doesn't replace them. It's actually a good addition to the existing DAMA certification. Okay, thanks, Jan-Willem. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a very good explanation of how these two programs really complement each other and how they go basically hand in hand and build on each other's train of thoughts. That kind of concludes the first section in which we talked about how this program came to light, what are the key business drivers of developing a program like that, and what the main structure is. In this second section, I will give you an overview of what the Big Data Framework actually looks like. So in this section, I'll be discussing 6 key capabilities that every enterprise organization that is interested in big data should have. So it's like a mini preview of what you will learn when you take the Enterprise Big Data Professional. But of course, given the constraints of time, I'm gonna all do this in a very high level and at a very high pace. So the Big Data Framework and the central model that has been developed based upon the input that we collected through all of the world is that in order to be successful as an enterprise organization in big data, there is 6 key or core capabilities, as we've labeled them, of things that an organization should have in place and things that people that are practicing big data should know about in order to become successful. And these 6 capabilities have been depicted in the model that you see on the slide here. And what I will do in the next section is I will very briefly walk through them. So as you can see on the model, there's 6 distinct capabilities, which start all the way from the establishing a big data strategy, which sets out the vision and mission of big data in the enterprise, all the way to the design of more technical principles, such as the big data architecture, the design of algorithms and processes, but also a lot of the people elements that I talked about in the first section, which has been incorporated in big data functions. So each of these capabilities really has a different domain, but it also means that you need to take into consideration all these domains before you can move to the next step. As a last capability, you see that also the whole element of artificial intelligence has been incorporated, which is kind of seen as a next or last step after you have incorporated big data. And the reason that this has been done is because artificial intelligence builds very much on the same tools and technologies and architecture that you would need to have set up your big data organization. So I'll come back to that a little bit later in the next slides. So what does that mean? What are those 6 elements discussing? Well, as I mentioned before, big data all starts with a good strategy, and we've seen in the first section that a lot of organizations really struggle to get success out of their big data projects, and very frequently that's because they also struggle to set up an effective big data strategy that provides tangible results on the investments that they're going to be making in big data. Starting with big data in any organization, small or large, is not going to be a very cheap exercise. It requires some investments in time, in people, in tools, in technology, in replacing legacy systems. So starting with that, without knowing the end result, or without a very sound business case, is typically not a very good idea. There's a famous saying in big data, which comes out of the movie Alice in Wonderland, and that is, if you don't know where you're going, every road will take you there. And that's exactly true for big data as well. There's such a vast amount of information that you can potentially analyze everything. And that makes it also very, very difficult, because how are you going to select which data sources you will include in your investigations or your analysis, and which ones you exclude? So in order to do that, you need to really think about the strategy that you aspire to follow, and how big data can be a positive influence for your own organization. So what are the steps that you need to take? So a very sound and structured big data strategy is frequently the first step to success in big data. And in the model on the right, you see the steps that we're going to be going through in order to establish a big data strategy like that. That's the first capability from the big data framework. The second one talks about how to set up a big data architecture, because in order to analyze these massive quantities of data, you need to have a really sound design from a technological point of view. And the model, or the central model that we are working with in the framework, is called the NIST Big Data Architecture. And as most of you will probably be familiar with, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies out of the US. And they provide guidelines which are also open source and free to use on how to establish good reference architectures. So as you can see on the slide, there's a lot of elements that come into play with designing a very good and sound big data architecture, which discusses key roles, key functions that need to be resolved with technology. But you also see that dimensions such as security and privacy and management aspects, which you see on the outer boxes, are taken into consideration in this model. So unfortunately, the time today does not permit us to go into the details of each little element, but those are the kind of things that you can expect to learn more about when you are in the architecture section of this course. There's no way that you can talk about big data and big data architecture without at least once mentioning Hadoop, which you also see on the slide. So this is the central framework and the central system that we're going to be working with in this big data framework, and the way to set up distributed processing and storage will all be done based upon the open source Hadoop platform. So now that we've discussed strategy and we've discussed architecture, we're going to get to everybody's favorite subject, and that is the subject of algorithm and statistics. So in the end, number crunching and analyzing large amounts of data is always going to be based on statistical operations and algorithms that need to be run against the massive quantities of data. So everybody who's working in the field of data science or big data in generally should have a basic understanding of how these operations work, and what do they do in order to return the results that that the companies are looking for. So what you see on this slide is some of the main statistical techniques that we're going to be talking about at the entry-level course, which are things like regression, classification, clustering, and outlier detection, which are all different types of statistical and algorithmic operations that can be applied to big data sets. So everybody who's working in this field should have at least a foundation or fundamental understanding of these kinds of operations, because they explain how the numbers in the end are being crunched. Of course, this first entry-level course will not go into too many specifics. If you would be interested in a detailed analysis and a detailed deep dive into algorithms, the Big Data Analyst course is going to be the right one for you, which is the second level. In that course, the each of these algorithms is explained into much more detail. So that's the third part. And as I mentioned before, a lot of tool providers provide courses that are applicable there. But what most other courses don't take into account is that enterprises already have lots and lots of established processes. They have a large amount of regulations, requirements, and governance requirements that they need to adhere to and that they need to be compliant with. And in order to deal with that structurally and not as just a one-time setting up things, but more on a day-to-day basis, the fourth module of the Big Data Framework talks about how to establish processes. How do you make sure that big data is embedded in your organization or in a structured and really process-oriented way, in such a way that it's measurable, in such a way that it can be repeated over time, and in such a way that you can measure the outcomes of these results. So what we're doing in the Big Data Framework is that we're breaking down the process section into three main elements. And the first one is the data analysis or data analytics process that really discusses how do you deal with analyzing large sets of data in a structured way. I sometimes frequently refer to it as the project management of doing data science. What are the steps that you go through in order to solve a problem, and what are the things that you need to take into account? A second and a second and very important element that has grown greatly in importance, especially over the last couple of months, is how do you deal with your data governance? What we mean with that is how do you, on the one hand, make sure that you keep big data effective and that it can help you achieve the results that you want to have, where on the other hand, you're also following all the rules and regulations that are currently in place and are set by various governing bodies or governments across the world. And one of the key developments, of course, in that field in recent months has the introduction of GDPR, which basically says you cannot share personal or proprietary information from customers across borders. So if you want to analyze customer feedback or customer details from different countries in a big data tool, for instance, how do you deal with that? How do you make sure that you analyze those different data sets but still are compliant to GDPR? So data governance goes into this area and sets up the policies and the requirements to actively measure and report back on that. And that basically brings me to the last element of the processes, which is the data management process. The data management process basically executes everything that we've discussed in data governance and data analysis, but then on a day-to-day basis. So in this process, we're going to be describing KPIs, we're going to be measuring them against certain results, and really make sure that data management is done on a day-to-day basis in order that the quality of the data, in order to ensure that the quality of the data is going to remain valid over time. So as you can see, I think big data processes are a very, very essential and fundamental part of making big data successful in larger organizations. And that brings me to the last, or the fifth element of the big data framework, which is the last one out of the inner blocks. And that talks about, well, how do you set up big data in an organization? So as I mentioned in the first section, again, this discusses the people aspect, because you can have all the fancy tools and the best hires in the world. In the end, big data is changing your organization one step at a time. And very, very similar to other changes in organizations, you will need to deal with resistance. You will need to convince people that this is the right approach. So in module 5, we really talk about how do we enable an organization and how do we win the hearts and the minds of the people that are working with big data on a day-to-day basis. Because for them, a lot will change. In order to make data-driven decisions, you really need to enable and empower people to think in a different way. And one of the central models that is discussed here is how do you set up a big data center of excellence? So one uniform point in the organization where knowledge, processes, and capabilities are all combined, and people can come and go to request information. So in the design of such a big data center of excellence, you really need to take into account lots of different elements and enable people to do a good job on a day-to-day basis. So again, I think this is one of the modules that really makes this big data framework so applicable to whichever organization you are and wherever you are in the world, because the people aspect comes into play in any big enterprise. And that brings us to the topic of artificial intelligence. As you remember from the central model, the artificial intelligence section is the outer ring, and basically that builds one level further upon established big data processes. So what that means is that as soon as you've set up a good big data strategy, you have a sound architecture, you have good algorithms, processes, and functions in place, then making the last step towards AI does not require a whole different kind of setup. AI builds further upon everything that big data already does. You don't require a completely different architecture. You don't require completely different processes in order to move from big data to AI. So lots of organizations that will ask you the question, how do I move towards artificial intelligence? I know it's a hot topic, but how do I actually get there? Well, the answer is actually very simple. Start with big data first, because if you don't have your big data organization in place, it's going to be very, very difficult to move towards AI. The opposite is also true. If you have very sound processes and structure in place for big data, then making the next step towards artificial intelligence is not going to be that hard, because the underlying models, the underlying architecture, the underlying processes are all more or less the same. So in this last section of the big data framework, we really talk about how do you move from big data towards artificial intelligence as one of the major next steps in the model. And with that, basically, I've come to conclude my very, very high level overview of the big data framework and the 6 main elements that are included there. So as a short recap, you see that we've started with discussing strategy, which is the block that you see right in the middle, and then moved from the right all the way to the bottom to the left. So we talked about setting up an architecture first, discussing algorithms afterwards, setting up your processes and functions, and how in the end, if you have all that in place, you can make the next steps towards artificial intelligence. So that's a very high level overview of what the framework is and what are the core elements of that specific framework. That's the second section. In this last section, I will give you some pointers and some core advice of how to get started yourself. So I've given you the business reasons for the big data framework in the first section. I've discussed the theoretic model and the central framework in the second section. And now in this third section, I'm going to talk to you about what are the steps that you can take yourself and how can you get started with big data as an individual. And the first thing that I would really advise is to download the Enterprise Big Data Guide. So this is the official textbook that is going to be the basis of the exam. And the great news that, as I mentioned before, this is given out under a Creative Commons license, and that means that it's absolutely free. And what we mean with that, free is actually free. So no hidden cost, no nothing that you need to pay for at the end. You just fill in your email address and this guide is going to be sent to you free of charge. So with this, in this book, you're going to find all the detailed information of everything that I just talked about in section 2, only of course in a much greater detail. It's a guide of around 120, 130 pages, and it discusses in depth what are the requirements and what are the different sections that are part of this professional course. So that's a great place to start if you're interested in pursuing the topic of big data further in your own career. The second step that, of course, I would highly recommend is take the certification courses, and you can do that with a provider. You can also do that under self-study and just take the exam online, because I think these 4 certifications really are growing to become the industry standards very, very rapidly. Ever since the launch, we've certified a couple of hundred people in diverse areas. So it's really starting to become like a best practice standard very, very quickly. So of course, start with the Enterprise Big Data Professional certification, and then decide which of the other modules might be applicable depending on your interest. If you're more interested in engineering or in infrastructure, then go for the engineering course. If you're more interested in how to design and develop algorithms, the scientist course would be good for you. And if you would like to know more how do you analyze data on a day-to-day business, then the analyst course would be the suitable one. So that will also be a very good next step to take if you're serious about pursuing a career in big data. And with that, I think I'm out of advice, at least for this moment. I'd like to hand back to Laurie, that is going to talk us a little bit through what APMG does and why we have collaborated on this particular framework.
Thanks very much, Jan-Willem. Just checking my voice level there. It's all good.
Yeah, it's perfect.
That's
good.
Good.
Loud and clear.
Thank you. That's great. Look, we're starting to finish and come into questions, and the questions about where do you get the certification. A number of people will probably just in case people haven't heard about APMG, a few dot points there. I'm the business development manager. I was a trainer prior to coming over to the accreditation body that APMG is. I'm located in Canberra. And I help develop business from here in New Zealand and also help out in Malaysia. Could you maybe just pop the next slide, please, there, Jan-Willem? For people in DAMA, I also want you to consider that APMG, we really do have offices all around the globe, and I'd urge you to have a look at our website, and particularly know that you may have contacts, particularly today in Australia, but if you've got other contacts and friends in other areas, which will be covered. Next slide, please. That's it. If you, we will be sending you a PDF of the slide pack, and this is today, as well as the recording. But already you can go onto our website. If you just probably Google the word certification, big data, APMG, you should come up with a page that looks a little bit like this. And on there, one of the things you can start to look at, right there, Jan-Willem, there's more information that's usually added on useful links and documentation as we go through. You can also, if you want to find a training provider, the really good news is in Australia we have 2 accredited training organisations that are getting through the final stages of accreditation. Just on that, we make sure that the trainers that you have got industry experience. They are also judged independently for their ability to convey and conduct teaching, but they are also tested on product knowledge independently, not only initially, but every 12 months. So when I say they're going through that accreditation, there's quite a big work to do. But we're aiming in Australia to have the first courses of availability in August, if we can, late August. So my suggestion, if anyone is interested in the course, please, as we're coming through to the question and answer section, yes, next slide, please, Jan-Willem, is when we send this back through, I will, my email contact will be there, and certainly with Andrew. We're very interested. If you feel that what you've heard today is of interest and interested in some of the courses, it would really help us build that demand and see where the demand might be. The providers that we have do provide both in Malaysia and all across Australia and New Zealand. So we'd be very interested to hear from you as an association, Andrew, and your members with the demand. So I might, thanks, Jan-Willem. I might just before we go, you've just been doing some training in Singapore, I believe. Is that correct? In other areas?
Yeah. So the the courses have already been picked up by the Singapore government and some major oil and gas companies in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia.
Right. Yes.
It's, where we do a lot of work, and of course we're not doing that in Australia. Yeah, it's been very good to note that ever since the launch, and I think it's really in conjunction with the fact that there's so much demand for this topic. We've been, teaching these courses on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, look, it's been a very good question. Thank you, person that's just put in, do DAMA members get any discounts on the examination? You've probably been reading our minds, person who wrote that in, because we will be looking at what we can offer through the training provider or through SSS. So we're currently starting this off, and we'll be working with Andrew on that. Any other questions? I'll hand over to Jan-Willem to moderate that, or to Andrew to moderate that. Any questions that people have, please put through the chat function. Do you have any questions in the meantime, Andrew, that you had?
No, not really. That was somebody stolen my question I was thinking of.
Right.
So it's interesting that in Singapore and Malaysia it's picked up already. I'm told that they're much more into big data over there than they are here. I don't know how true that is, but yes.
Well, I think there's a some very interesting developments, if I can answer that, especially if you look in terms of what governments are doing with big data. So Singapore, for example, made a website available, and that is data.gov.singapore, and on that website they post all their public data sets, so things that the government is sourcing, and they make that data available for the public just to analyze, to see if they can find something useful, and basically they host competitions for the most usable solutions. So of course lots of universities, students, but even corporates are using the data that is provided by the government in their decision making. So I think this is really one of those really forward-looking countries that has a very sound strategy on how they want to use data in the day-to-day, in the public domain. So yeah, I think that's probably one of the reasons that I picked up on this very, very early on. But I think a similar situation will be happening in Australia very, very soon.
That's good. We've got in response to that, thank you very much, Silva, who's just written in there, we do have an open data portal, data.act.gov.au. So, some of the precedents, if you're talking to in your workplace or people know, there's some precedents where this is being used in Singapore that we can build from. 3 or 4 other slides there. Do you have any AI-specific framework that can be built on top of this big data framework? Thank you, Asta. Do you have any AI-specific framework?
No, there's not an AI-specific framework at this moment. So in this framework, we talk about artificial intelligence as an extension of big data, and we use something which we call cognitive analytics as the main extension of big data in that regards. It's not a separate framework yet, but of course, depending on how much interest we get and how many people think there's a requirement for a framework in AI as well, that's always something that we can consider. So I would very strongly urge the person that asked this question to drop us an email and explain a bit why this requirement, why you think there would be a requirement for this, and if this is something that we can work on towards the future. Because after a big data framework, of course, it would be very logical to also think about how to make an AI framework.
Yes, no, that's good, and I think if everyone's got Andrew, would you mind if we could emails come through you, because that might be there might be more than one sort of question. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, that's fine.
A couple other questions. Are the slides going to be made available? Absolutely, Simon. They will be. The slides will be kept separate, and then we'll have the recording session for you to download. That'll probably, the recording session, give us a day or so to get that loaded up on the DAMA website, I believe, Andrew. That's where you were looking, web page?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll send out the link. Yep.
Fantastic. Scott, thanks very much for this question. One for you, Jan-Willem, is when will the EBDA, EBDS and EBDE be available?
The EBDA is planned for September, and the EBDS is planned for December, and the engineering course is planned for March 2018.
Fantastic. And
2019.
Yeah, 2019. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, no, not this March.
Okay. And just on that, just to confirm, one will have to do the EBDP before doing any of the others? Is it like a succession?
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct. So the EBDP is a prerequisite for any of the other courses. And as I just mentioned, there's a lot of like basic knowledge that is going to be assumed present in the next modules. So things like statistical operations, things like the framework itself, things like the basic principles of the underlying architecture, things like what is Hadoop. All those kind of things are assumed present or assumed known in the follow-up courses. So the second level courses really take a much more of a deep dive, which is why it's been decided that the EBDP course is going to be a mandatory prerequisite before you can take any of the additional courses.
Yeah, that's good. I think also everybody listening, a great feature, and we're seeing this emerging more in our courses, where your text reference book is free. You know, the logistics and the carbon footprint of sending, you know, textbooks around the globe is starting to, I think we're finally addressing that. And I think when you're looking at multiple courses, that's starting to reduce the cost of doing that. So it is a good initiative, isn't it, Jan-Willem? It's a bit of a trend we're seeing.
Absolutely.
So just on that, the other thing I would like there's one question that's come in: how do I become a trainer in enterprise big data? Well, it's remiss of me not to say that we certainly have 2 training providers that are getting accredited. But if you are an expert in big data and you like what you see here, please, through Andrew or myself, I'm very easy to contact, have a chat to me, because I know that these 2 providers are always looking for associate trainers. So if you've got particular knowledge of enterprise big data, we can certainly assist you. So, you know, there will be a demand, and if we've got experts in the field, haven't we, Jan-Willem? It's nice to have experts stand up and say, I'd like to become a trainer.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can add on that, because of course it's a very good question, there's also a bit of additional requirements. So one thing I'd like to explain is that for in order to become a trainer, you need to get a 10% pass mark above the regular pass mark. So in this case, for the EBDP exam, that means that you need to pass the exam with at least 75%. And you also would need to go through a knowledge interview with APMG. That assesses whether you would be a suitable trainer to teach this profile. So we do have a very structured way of accrediting trainers to make sure that the quality and the integrity of this product is going to be maintained across the globe.
Yeah, and in addition to that, we look at we actually have a minimum of observation of 4 hours of you delivering either 4 1-hour sessions or a 4-hour session to people in the classroom. So we're also making sure that you've got the ability to deliver and handle questions. Training's not easy, but it's incredibly rewarding, and I'm sure that in the number of people we have today in your association, Andrew, there are some potential trainers there. I'd be very surprised if there's not. Any other?
Sure. Yep.
We look like we're going well with time. We haven't. Thank you, everyone, for using the chat function. I think that's worked really well, and we have answered all the questions. Andrew, do you have any other questions before we close? And then last comment, your last comment to Jan-Willem, and then I'll get you to close.
No, I don't. It was a very interesting presentation. Thanks a lot, Jan. It was a good introduction to big data, I thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much for taking the initiative to co-host this webinar. I really think it was useful in order to give like a very sneak preview of what this is all about. And I hope this has been an interesting experience for your members.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Jan-Willem, and everybody in the association. This is really important for us when we're launching a new product in this area to have connections with a professional association that's quite specific in big data. I think is going to help both of us. So, Andrew, we'll be certainly talking more, the three of us. So, everybody, I'll be stopping the recording now, and thank you very much for your time.